Justin Trudeau has lost control of everything after 9 years. He's lost control of spending, lost control of the deficit, lost control of immigration and the border.
There is a tradition in Canada that when times are tough, when there's a moment of crisis, or when we're threatened, Canadians pull together. We step up, we go across partisan lines, and we defend Canada. It seems increasingly clear that that is not something Pierre Poilievre is able to do.
Well, it's been 1 week since Justin Trudeau made his surprise trip to Mar-a-Lago, and since then, the Prime Minister's attempts to build a political Team Canada has had mixed results. So where does all of this leave the government in its bid to present a united front to ward off Donald Trump's tariff threat? Well, it's time to bring in our party insiders. Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the NDP. She's away tonight, but she's still here. And here with me in person in studio, Greg McEachern, former Liberal ministerial staffer, and Fred Delory, a former Conservative campaign manager. It's good to see you all. I haven't checked Flight Tracker in the last 10 minutes, so I don't know if we're going to get derailed this week like we did last week. But Fred, let's start with you. I mean, what do you make of what we saw between Poilievre and Trudeau this week, in that the Prime Minister calls the leaders together and says, let's stop talking down the issues that Trump wants to raise because it's bad for the country, but Poilievre and them say, we're the opposition, this is our job. Where do you think this leaves the country with the clock ticking down to January 20th?
It's not just counting down to January 20th, we're counting down to an election. We're there soon. And what the Prime Minister what we just played there, it boiled my blood a bit just hearing that, talking about how we all need to get together now, put things aside, and not be, we have to have this Team Canada approach. We did that 3 years ago during the pandemic. We had a Team Canada approach where we, the opposition parties worked with the government to make things happen. And what did Prime Minister Trudeau do? He called an election in the middle of the pandemic. We couldn't even campaign properly. We couldn't tour properly. We had to wear masks during the campaign. So here he is playing this card now, how we all need to get along, when he clearly didn't 3 years ago, played it then, and then betrayed us all by calling an election.
Okay, we're going to put Fred down as undecided. Greg, what are your thoughts on this?
I guess the only time you can call an election is when the Conservatives want one.
2 years in a minority government, when you have full support of all parties, Greg?
Yeah, okay.
Come on, that's...
I don't know. Average length of a minority before this government was 18 to 24 months. I don't think... Anyway, it's 2021. Let's talk today.
Okay.
I think... I totally disagree with everything that Fred said, and I'm super shocked. But I'm also in agreement with a few of the writers of the Globe and Mail, not exactly the headquarters of the Justin Trudeau fan club. So Andrew Coyne particularly went after the Conservative leaders this week. He talked about the Prime Minister being professional, adult, reasonable, and prime ministerial, and that Poilievre looked jittery, uncertain, off key, and definitely not prime ministerial. Campbell Clark talked about how people in Quebec this reacted very badly to Poilievre's approach. I think the Conservative leader read it as Justin Trudeau versus Donald Trump, and that he could treat this like every other partisan issue. And I think most people, especially around tariffs, are looking at this as the Prime Minister of Canada versus Donald Trump. And this is a job that Poilievre says that he wants. And he had a really terrible week. I've heard Shannon Proudfoot on your show and in her writing also talked about how this was a moment where Poilievre wasn't really ready for.
Maybe. I just want to point out, Mel, Greg missed a perfect opportunity to remind Fred of his line that is power in politics, not politics and feelings, because he was obviously very upset with the early election call. But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, Jagmeet Singh is gotten in line with the Team Canada approach for the most part. There were some shots about going to Mar-a-Lago and coming back empty-handed, though I don't know if one meal solves a tariff issue. What are your thoughts on where things are politically right now on this?
Right. So I think Jagmeet's approach is the right one, right? You can oppose the Prime Minister. You can point the Prime Minister's failings in a way that isn't, punching Canada in the face. Because I think one of the problems with Monsieur Poilievre's approach is exactly that, is you're kind of fighting against our own best interests. So I kind of... don't often agree with the Prime Minister, but I did agree a little bit. We saw pollings. Our company did a poll this week, and other polling companies were in the field asking Canadians how they felt about what they heard from Donald Trump last week, and rightly, people are big majority terrified of what this would mean, what it would mean for their jobs, what it would mean for their cost of literally everything. So I think this is, playing a little bit to Pierre Poilievre's worst instinct is the, I'm going to take a shot because it's going to benefit me. But I don't think people are with him on this one. Even folks who are frustrated with the Prime Minister and who are, frustrated with this government and what they have and haven't done, I think above anything, are worried about what this means for them as Canadians, and they expect their leaders to rise above it sometimes. And I think what we saw this week is Pierre Poilievre showing again that he's unable to rise above it. He's unable to put, country before self, and we've seen this before, so it's not totally surprising, but it is disappointing.
So Fred, you touched on the two tensions right off the top, right? There is the timeline between now and the inauguration of Donald Trump in which this tariff threat needs to be settled, ideally, because that's the deadline the president-elect has given Canada and Mexico. And then there's the election timeline. How do you calibrate that? You heard the criticism from Greg and from Mel of Mr. Poilievre's approach. How do you calibrate this as an opposition leader in that your constitutional duty in Parliament to hold the government to account, but also not playing into the hands of an erratic and unpredictable president-elect in Donald Trump, who is threatening economic disaster on the country?
Well, that's it. We are at a place where we have a major change in the world. And we're going into an election year. We should be having an election now. The Prime Minister should call the election now so that either whoever wins will have a mandate to take on and deal with these issues. Right now, we're going into this where we're going to be 6 months down the road, potentially, dealing with a new administration in the U.S. and then having an election and then dealing with these issues. And then who knows what's going to come from that. If Trudeau thinks he can win the next election, he should call it now so that he could then present his plan and deal with the incoming administration. We're putting ourselves in a weak spot here where the way this is working.
But we talked just the bill, and then look, and I got a lot of people criticizing me on Twitter for raising this, but you could have an election now, we're in caretaker mode, and that's all the time to meet Donald Trump's demands, and you can't do it. So, I get your point that whoever is going to deal with this guy for the next 4 years should have, a popular, support of the Canadian people, and it should be evident in their standing in the polls and in Parliament. But you can't do that between now and the 20th of January, right? So there is this period where there's not enough time to have an election, swear in a new government, and then deal with it and meet the deadline of the 20th of January. So in this period, how do you calibrate it? If you're not going to get the election, if it's not going to happen, what calculations go into it as an opposition politician who is the front runner to not necessarily be seen as helping Trudeau, but not hurting Canada at the same time?
I think a big question a lot of people are pushing for or asking for is, will he be blindly cheering on?
I don't think anyone expects that.
No, but to be quiet, to go away as opposition leader, when every week we talk mostly about what Poilievre is bringing to the table and what he's pushing. We're asking him, go away now and not do anything while Trudeau gets to play and do whatever it is he's doing. I think we're in a really dangerous spot if Trudeau is going to lose the next election. It's not even if he's going to come in second, he may come in third or fourth. And we're getting closer and closer to that election date. We're going to be going mid-negotiation. We're talking about January 20th as his end date. I don't know, if he doesn't get there, if we don't have these tariffs, will he call the election then? If Trump doesn't pull back on January 20th and says none of this worked in the last few months, I'm not happy, will he call the election then because he failed? That's what's on the table here? Because if not, I just don't know where we're going on this. We're just going down a very dangerous path.
Well, Greg, if Trudeau is as weak as Poilievre says, you'll have the ultimate proof point if the tariffs go up on the 20th, right? And then that's the end of this government, no matter what I think happens. Because if they fail in this and the economy gets sideswiped by something that could cut 5 percentage points out of the GDP.
Hello, recession.
It's a disaster.
The recession that people have been predicting, 22, 23, would finally actually happen. I'm trying to follow Fred's train of thought here in that Justin Trudeau has to think of Canada first and call an election during a week where the leader of the opposition didn't actually and it is not just my opinion. People who get paid to write and talk on TV about this stuff, who are supposedly nonpartisan, have said, he did not hit the right note. He is not thinking of Canada first. But Fred's saying that, in order to be patriotic, you need to call an election right now. I think, the other part, let's just call it. It'd be, it's politically dumb to do that. Of course, the Prime Minister is going to try to do everything he can to win the next election. And it's not in, read polls. Every week we talk about the polls here.
For years
that's not going to happen. So I just kind of find this is really odd, especially in a week where the Conservatives turned down a chance to vote non-confidence in the government. They played with their own motion. So there's a lot of politics at play. Go figure. But December is a really bad time, as we know some of the stories about MPs' behavior right now. I think people need to think clearly. I think we need to see that Donald Trump has his inauguration, and we actually see if the 25% is real.
Right. So Mel, I wonder about this because, so Mr. Poilievre, he's not agreed to stop saying the border is broken and these things. He did that on the first day after the meeting, and then the next day on his way into question period, Justin Trudeau's like, this guy just can't put it aside to help Canada. So it's like, it's waving a red flag in front of a bull when you do something like that, right? It's going to provoke something from the leader of the opposition, and you're not sort of pulling it together less than 24 in both directions. It's fraying.
Right. Well, there's plenty of things to criticize the Prime Minister on. You can criticize him for failing to respond to folks who are, having a hard time making ends meet. You can talk about how the Prime Minister is failing to do things that matter for folks on affordability. But hey, President Trump is going to use this against us. He thinks that this is happening. Maybe we tone it down a little bit, or we remove the rhetoric from it, and the very next day it's, I'm going to use this because it's going to help me. And, everybody else be damned, because this is also going to help President Trump do what he wants to do, which is going to harm all of us. I don't buy it that as opposition leader you have to keep doing this. There are legitimate things that you can say the Prime Minister is failing to do, legitimate things that are harming people, but this would harm folks more than anything. So the fact that you can't tone it down, tone the rhetoric down. Don't even tone down the pointing out facts and what's actually happening, but the inflaming stuff that we know Donald Trump is hearing and Donald Trump can use to say, hey, Canada, you need to fix this if you don't want this 25% tariff. I think that's ridiculous, and I also think folks in my universe, at least, who don't consider themselves partisan and who are looking at the leaders to figure out who could meet the moment, respond to what they need in their lives to make life more affordable, but also just lead the country with a steady hand. This just doesn't pass the sniff test.
But it's interesting, Fred, because in question period on Wednesday, which is the Prime Minister's question period where he takes all the questions, Poilievre got up and gave a very effective dissection of the issues of the Trudeau government without saying the border is broken. He didn't even talk about that. He talked about a bunch of things on the economic side, the emissions cap, these things. Andrew Furey, the Liberal Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, came out against that as an oil-producing province. So, I don't think people read it as he stopped criticizing Trudeau, because that's never going to happen. But things like the border is broken, how does that handcuff the opposition to just not use that one line where there's no shortage of things on the menu to hit the Prime Minister with?
No, you're right. There's a million things to hit the Prime Minister with, and he's got to pick and choose which ones he does. And sometimes when media are asking and others are asking to what's your opinion on certain things, he's going to say it too.
Sure.
But there's no question there's so much to point out about how this government's failing. He's got lots of material he could lean on for that.
Greg, do you think it was a mistake, looking at where the country is now, to do the MAGA comparisons to attack the Conservatives? This was a talking point in Liberal videos, not the ads, videos that were put out on social media, and you heard it in question period, you've heard it from cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister himself. And David McNaughton said, knock it off, guys, because he could win this thing, and it's not going to go well. Now, he had the Mar-a-Lago dinner, but we haven't heard the MAGA stuff in a while.
Yeah, and I commented on this a couple of, maybe last week, where, in the UK, the current government was much more vehement. I noticed as it got closer to the election, it was more and more junior people in caucus using those. But to answer your question, yeah. It was. But again,
let me front load with context and then say yes.
Partly what I don't understand with Fred about the urgency to call an election and why, and I'm sure we'll get into this in a little bit about why the opposition leader doesn't have his security clearance. How are his hands tied? We're seeing polls where they're 20 points ahead. What is it that prevents him from leaving a couple of issues aside that are actually, factually wrong. Like Trump and his crew have said some things that are wrong about our border, in terms of fentanyl, in terms of guns. Why would you side on that when you have, as we've all just said, there are so many other things, and the Conservatives seem to be doing so damn well? Why the rush right now? Why the hurry? And I think part of the, what I saw in both, I mentioned Coyne's column, Campbell Clark's, is they talked about looking at Pierre Poilievre next to Donald Trump in this situation right now, and how would that comparison look? And I think, I could counter Fred's argument and say, I don't see that the leader of the opposition is all that ready to deal with Donald Trump based on what I saw this week.
Well, I mean, you don't know until you know, right? I don't know. Have we known about Trump what we know now the first time around? How would people have felt about Trudeau back then? Because he was a very new prime minister. I don't know. But, it is interesting, Mel, that we're in this situation. Public opinion polling is showing that some people do think Pierre Poilievre is the right guy to deal with Donald Trump. Maybe he'll get his chance, but for the next 44 days, 43 days, it is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's window of opportunity. So what do you expect will happen in this political environment here? The premiers have kind of gotten there. Do you think all of the federal leaders will get there in the time that's available?
I think all of the federal leaders but one, because I'm just going to go back to that, like the worst instinct, right? And we've talked about this on this show on different issues, for the last year. It's the taking a shot just to take a shot, because you think it's going to help you instead of proving the point that you're trying to make, which is you're fit supposedly to be prime minister. I don't think that we're going to see him get on board, but to your point of the premiers, I think that's, you disagree with the guy. A lot of the premiers see the prime minister as the perfect opposition for them themselves to be reelected, but they've gotten on board, or, quote unquote on board, because they know that it's too important not to. So, yeah, I hope I'm wrong, but I think we're going to see. Pierre Poilievre continue this, and of course, as folks know, December kind of turns into silly season in Ottawa, and folks are maybe not their best selves as a starting point. So we may just see a little bit more of that in the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, the clock is ticking, and the stakes are high, and we'll see if any of these divisions become a problem, or if they can somehow, the government of the day can convince the president-elect to down his tariffs. Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown made it pretty clear to a parliamentary committee yesterday that India did pressure his campaign team over policy disagreements during the last Conservative leadership race.
There was concern from MP Garner about some of the language that I was using, and in Gujaras and the membership drives, there was concern from I believe the Consul General directly to the MP that I used the word Sikh Nation, and so we had a conference call how to deal with that concern.
But Brown made it equally clear he didn't think that interference affected the final outcome of that race, which Pierre Poilievre won in a landslide. Meanwhile, a profile in the New York Times about the Foreign Affairs Minister has some people buzzing about a possible Liberal leadership race. Our party insiders are back with me, Melanie Richer, Fred Delory, and Greg McEachern. I want to start with the Patrick Brown stuff. Fred, there was a bit of a report in the NSI COP report about India meddling in a leadership race. This was something that was known, has been talked about in CSIS documents. Patrick Brown confirmed there was some sort of intervention there. Michelle Rempel-Garner did leave as the national co-chair. Not because of this, she says, because she was thinking about running to replace Jason Kenney in Alberta. But the fact that the Consul General and diplomats are leaning on his senior campaign leadership to get him to change his policies, what does that tell us about India and foreign interference in that race?
Right. Well, it shows that there is some pressure being applied by these other countries. And for a reminder, I also was on the Patrick Brown campaign. I supported him on that campaign.
Ah, right. About
and that. I was not. All I got from.
Did India call you? No.
No one called me. It's funny. I was national campaign manager for the Conservative Party too when the allegations about the Chinese interference, and I was actually a campaign chair for Patrick. So I seem to be one of the common denominators. But I'm not sure what people have against me.
Yeah.
Other countries do, but I actually was not aware of this, other than what I read in news stories.
What do you make of it, though? I mean, by the way, and Justice Oak will be waiting for you outside the studio when we're done. But what do you make of the fact that this happened?
Yeah. Well, on that point, Justice Oak has the NSICOP's report and all that, and it's she obviously read this, saw the full unredacted thing, and never called Mayor Brown or Rempel-Gardner to the inquiry. So I think that really says where this stands, where they
that we know
think how. Look, there's obviously a hot issue in India when it comes to Sikh nationalism, and Canada is the largest country in the world with Sikh. With
diaspora.
Sikh diaspora. So it is an issue here to them when they are, they didn't like what some of the stuff Patrick Brown was saying, and they made that clear. Watching all of this, and I watched the committee yesterday, and I'm just like, where are we going here? I don't know what solutions are to this when a country is doing this and someone weighs in. What's the repercussion? What can our government do back? I saw the Liberals really turn up the heat politically on this. They really tried to make this a partisan thing, which was disappointing. I saw in the House Jennifer O'Connell basically implying that Pierre Poilievre won his leadership because of this, which is complete nonsense. The man sold more memberships than, in fact, 3 times more than Trudeau, and you had to pay for a Conservative Party membership when it was free for Trudeau. But I don't know. We were having these discussions, and no one is putting forth solutions. And it's the same with the Chinese interference. I don't know, what are we doing to actually to deal with this other than just try to make political hay?
Well, look, I watched that committee too. A lot of it yesterday. I agree. There was a lot of hypocrisy going around there, right? Like the Liberals trying to make this a political failure of the Conservatives for not dealing with it when it was in their party, and the Conservatives complaining about it being politicized and it was too important to do that, and you flip that around. You flip that around at Don Valley.
I'm being consistent. It's a complete flip from the Chinese.
Exactly. It's Don Valley North in total reverse, right?
I'm being consistent.
Fred has always said this whole thing is a waste of time because it's not dealing with the root issue. But Greg, I wonder what you make of this. So that this happened, was discussed on a conference call, and nobody kind of reported it up the chain or reported it out. This seems. The Indian consulate, they're all expelled now, or a lot of them are expelled now, but this stayed very quiet.
As I recover from Fred's observation that there's gambling in this casino, I will say Mayor Pat buried the lead on this. He said he didn't have much to bring, and it has consumed the news cycle for a day. The big revelation is Michelle Rempel-Gardner, when she was answering questions, never said anything about a call or a meeting with the Indian Consul General. She answered very carefully or ran away from the reporters. And this is an MP that writes a lot, Substack, op-eds, everything. And there are lots of Conservatives who have used the same hypocrisy that we're talking about, using foreign interference as a political wedge or tool. But I don't understand what happened with this information, because Mr. Poilievre's office claims that this is the first time, or that they were never told of it. And I know that we talked about it on this panel back in March after the Fifth Estate had a documentary that raised the allegations that this was involved in the Conservative leadership race. And we also have a Conservative leader who refuses to get a security clearance. So if you don't know, it's because you absolutely don't want to know.
Yeah, and look, I have my handy copy of the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, and the redacted reference to this is on page 32. We have no idea if this Patrick Brown stuff is what they're talking about. If there's more than this, we don't know, because we can't know. But it was interesting to hear from Patrick Brown, Mel, that, there were efforts. He says it didn't affect the outcome, which is probably true, because Pierre Poilievre is an organizing machine, but also Patrick Brown was disqualified for that race for a bunch of other reasons. It had nothing to do with India, as far as we know. But what did you make of what we learned, and the fact that it's taken all of this for people to learn that India was doing this in that race?
Right. I think the big message is this just proves why it's important for Pierre Poilievre to get his security clearance, because if you aren't getting briefed on this, how are you expected to address it? How are you expected to fix it? How are you expected to, safeguard party leaderships from having any of that interference? Now, did it change the vote or the outcome, I should say? Probably not, to your point, but it's still probably worries Canadians, particularly in this case, Sikh Canadians, that India was able to influence in some way the party leaders or the party leadership race. So I think, if anything, what this underscores is if Pierre Poilievre actually wants to be Prime Minister, which he says he does, he needs to get a security clearance. Because to your point of the, the partisanship back and forth on this, I think super fair, Fred, that you're seeing it from both sides. You're seeing it from the Liberals and the Conservatives. But this is like important. And if we want to move forward, if we want to safeguard party leaderships, if we want to safeguard elections, all of it, from foreign interference, we need to start acting. Totally agree with you there, Fred. We need the result. What is it that we're doing? But in order to do that, party leaders need their security clearance, and they need to be able to take actions, not just to support actions that the government is taking to safeguard elections, but also to take actions to safeguard leadership races.
Well, there was a bit of politics from the NDP yesterday too, Mel, because Alistair McGregor was doing his damnedest to get Patrick Brown to say what you just said, that Pierre Poilievre needs to get a security clearance, but he wouldn't bite, right? But like, Fred, how do you approach this? Like, we now know that India and if government officials were doing this to push back against the interests and the causes of sick Canadians. This is a sizable population in this country, and a foreign government was taking action against it in an internal party process. How do you deal with that if you're the Conservative leader and you're not willing to get the security clearance to find out exactly what the challenges and the pressure points were?
Well, I think the plan is for Pierre Poilievre is when he's Prime Minister, this is an issue he can deal with. Right now, he can't. His hands are tied. We are in a political system where, the Prime Minister and the opposition leader are at each other. They're going full tilt, as we discussed a lot tonight, on a lot of different issues. So for him to get a security clearance, I don't know what's going to come of this. There's not like he's going to be able to put forth a plan that Prime Minister Trudeau then adopts on how we deal with this. I think it's when he's Prime Minister, and then he will have to then figure out if there's something out of this. And if we all agree that Trudeau can't do this, then maybe we should have the election now. We've been dealing with foreign interference for a couple of years now. Things coming forward. Yeah. If it's a big enough issue, let's have an election.
But, so you need to be Prime Minister to deal with an internal party leadership.
Well, I don't. Well,
if Jagmeet Singh wants to fix something in the NDP leadership rules, they can do it, can't they? Like, they don't need to be Prime Minister.
No, it's the party membership chooses, not leaders, in terms of how parties work. But no, but look, what have the NDP changed their rules since any of this come out? Since he's had his.
But this is the only leadership that has been implicated.
Their leader has.
That's why
what would the rule be? Like, think about how leaderships work. There's no like, okay, so if what rule would anyone put forth from this? We're not talking sensibly.
There's not a second right now that I would believe that if this was the Liberals, Pierre Poilievre would be all over this. He cannot say that he has to wait till he's Prime Minister.
But you're saying he needs to get it cleared so he can change the leadership rules?
Absolutely, I'm saying
so
he needs to get his security
So he should change the leadership rules.
And so is everybody else.
So because of the leadership rules?
Or know what he's dealing with. I think that's more the issue, right?
What rule should come in from this?
Canada first. That's my rule.
That's a rule?
That's my rule. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, well, look, I'm just saying.
We're in silly season here, too, apparently, not just.
Well, okay, all right. Well, but look, if every answer is going to be called an election, like, what are we doing, right? Like,
but you're saying he should get a security clearance so that he should put in new rules for the party?
The biggest country on earth was meddling in a leadership race and in national elections. And all the other leaders have read the documents explaining this, except one, and that's a frontrunner to be Prime Minister. And we don't know what they've done to deal with this because it's top secret and they're not allowed to tell us, but that doesn't presume they haven't done things. I mean, think about all the conversations we had about Don Valley North. That's a single nomination and a single riding for a now independent backbencher, and that was just about Chinese students, maybe or maybe not coming on a bus to vote in it. And this is the leader of the party. We don't know the impact, what it was done, or if there's more than the Patrick Brown thing. We just don't know, and we don't know if anyone's dealing with it, right? I mean, doesn't that concern you?
The Prime Minister of Canada and the leader of the New Democratic Party, the fourth party in the House, which is his coalition, sometimes partner, have both had lots of briefings on this, and neither of them have put forth any sort of recommendation. They could go into the Elections Act if they think there's something on this. There's lots they could do. They've done zero on this. So I don't understand.
I'm not following the connection of getting a security clearance.
Well, that was the conversation we had, that he should do something about party leadership.
Plan. No, it's about whether or not you are availing yourself of all the information possible to protect your country. That's what it's about. It's not about coming up with a plan, and we still have the justice still on this. But that is just a straw man argument to pretend why he doesn't need to get a security clearance. And the longer that he doesn't get it, and the more things that pop up. I mean, if Michelle Rempel-Garner goes to committee and starts being asked questions about who did you tell after you were called on this, and the answer is nobody, well, again, the Conservatives are not going to look really strong on this issue. They were really after Han Dong, but all of a sudden they're very quiet.
Okay, I'm going to move on to our...
He was accused of something where Conservatives are not.
Right.
We're the victims in all of these things we're talking about here.
Okay.
We were the targets.
And Han Dong may have been, because nobody is anyway. I want to move on, Mel, to this, because I want to get your comms perspective on the Melanie Joly profile in the New York Times. I had her on the show earlier and asked her about this. She said it was an interview done in July. I don't know why the Times waited until now to publish it, but they did. And you know, she said she was speaking to foreign media because she's the foreign affairs minister. But this frames her as a possible successor, and it was done in July. They lost Toronto St. Paul's in late June, and that was a big inflection point for the Prime Minister's leadership. What do you make of this? She says she's 100% loyal. That seems to have been the case, but does that suggest someone's firing a starting pistol here?
Right, 100% loyal, but, right? Like when you've got a but there, you've got a however there. In communications training, if you've got a but or a however, everything you've said before that doesn't exist anymore, right? Because you've now said this thing. I just... oof is what I would say to this interview from a caucus management, from a cabinet management. Just the optics are not good. You know, you mentioned that this would have happened probably a month, or the interview would have taken place probably a month after Toronto St. Paul's, and a month before what happened in Montreal. So I don't know what you do with this, and I know it happened in July, but that just can't stand. I just. Yeah, that's a tough interview and tough positioning for the Prime Minister, who's trying to convince caucus, who's trying to convince cabinet, who's trying to convince Canadians really that he deserves to stay. That's tricky. And in the New York Times of all places, I don't know. I don't know. When I was director of communications, you did not do very many, and this is maybe going to sound crazy, but you did not do very many interviews, particularly not, you know, national interviews, without telling your comms team, without telling, you know, me or my colleagues. If the New York Times was calling, you bet that comms was going to, you know, check to make sure that was a good interview for you to do first. So this, to me, just seems so beyond that somebody who has been a minister for so long did. Like, you're not, you know what you were doing by doing this interview. But what can the Prime Minister do when you've got that letter writing campaign with a bunch of caucus members asking for him to resign? This is just, to me, another a hard pill to swallow, and hard to then turn around and tell people, you know, my affairs are in order, and this is what I'm doing for you. This was, you know, I feel like we've stopped hearing about caucus comments. This brings us right back to that.
Well, as predicted, once Trump got elected, forget your caucus letter. Look, we've got to be tight on this, but Fred, she also said she did an interview with Chatelaine, and a similar thing ran, but Chatelaine in the New York Times, you know, carry a little bit more weight. There's a book out about Chrystia Freeland that she was asked about that she had nothing to do with, so that's a totally separate thing. But what do you make of this Joly article?
Well, look, anytime you see a leadership contender or potential one put out some kind of profile like that, it's a very clear indication they're organizing, they're doing something, they're thinking it in their mind. And her comments about and Melanie kind of poked at this about, you know, I 100% support Trudeau, but we need to adapt. And what is that? Like, it's a pretty damning statement by her. And I know I've been involved in a lot of leadership campaigns. When you launch, you do a soft launch, and you do it in a really friendly, where your base is reading it. And it's fascinating that the Canadian Liberal Party think the New York Times is where their base is.
Or it could be Chatelaine. Greg, last word to you.
I think it's interesting that the interview didn't run. I had an experience, and I'm just a schmuck, I'm not a cabinet minister, where I did an interview about Pascal St-Onge, and there was a cabinet shuffle, and it ran like 8 months later at a time which was kind of interesting. So I think the timing's interesting. Listen, as a Liberal, I'm not too chuffed by this, because the Prime Minister has indicated he's going to run in the next election. Part of the issue of the conversations the last couple of months have been that there's nobody waiting in the wings. We're kind of allergic because of the Paul Martin Chrétien things. It's okay for people to do some long-range planning.
Okay, long-range planning. That's a good euphemism. All right, Fred Delory, Greg McKecker, and Melanie Richer, thank you all for being here.